Good morning. We're going to be looking at the Bible together, looking at God's Word. We're going to be continuing our Elisha series, which if you've been with us for a while, if you've been with us for a while, it's a little while since we've been in Elisha. It's a little bit like a kind of 2-week encore to a series that we finished in November. But if you cast your mind back to that strange desert prophet who did increasingly odd things in every passage that we read, and yet this thread of the provision of God through everything that was going on, we're in a similar kind of story. We're going to be in 2 Kings 6 and 7. If you've got your Bible with you, it'll help you. It's a reasonably long story, so I'm going to kind of read it in sections and talk about it so we can catch that thread as we go. And it's, well, I think it's meant to be funny. I don't know if that's going to come across in the English translation, but we'll kind of try and tease that out a little bit as we go. But I'm reading from 2 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 24. Afterward, you might not remember where we got to, but Elisha had essentially saved a bunch of Syrian soldiers. He's an enemy of Israel. It's all kind of gone, it looked like it all gone a bit wrong, and he rescued them, strangely, rather than who you might expect him to rescue, and it looked like everyone was friends again. Afterwards, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, mustered his entire army and went up and besieged Samaria. And there was a great famine in Samaria as they besieged it, until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and a fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. Now as the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, "Help, my lord, O king." And he said, "If the Lord will not help you, how shall I help you? From the threshing floor, from the wine press?" And the king asked her, "What is your trouble?" And she answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give your son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him. And on the next day I said to her, 'Give your son, that we may eat him,' but she has hidden her son." When the king heard the words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Now he was passing by on the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth beneath on his body. And he said, "May God do so to me, and more also, if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today." Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. Now the king dispatched the man from his presence. But before the messenger arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Do you see how this murderer has sent to take off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold the door fast against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him?" And while he was still speaking with them, the messenger came down to him and said, "This trouble is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" But Elisha said, "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow at about this time, a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." Then the captain, on whose hands the king leaned, said to the man of God, "If the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be?" But he said, "You shall see it with your own eyes, but shall not eat of it." So that's our setup. Things are pretty dire. A little bit beyond dire. You can barely talk about how incredibly awful the situation must be that these 2 mothers began to even consider what it seems to have happened. And we have a lot of strange economic information about how much it costs to buy a donkey's head, which is about, in today's money, kind of minimum wage for a day's work to buy a donkey's head, which is an awful lot of money for something that no one wants to eat and would make you ritually unclean, so you can't enter the temple or the presence of God. And about a tenner for a litre of dove's dung, which is, again, an awful lot of money for something that isn't very useful. It's not unclear whether they want to burn it or eat it, but it's not very good for either. And then obviously they contemplate and even engage in cannibalism because there is no food. This is probably year 7 of a famine, and maybe for about the last year the Syrians have been camped outside, making the whole thing worse than it was before. To say that things are bad would be a gross understatement. They're trapped in the city. There is nothing to eat. They cannot provide for themselves. And I'm sure every single person in Samaria fearing for their future. I'm sure in one way none of us can relate. What on earth would that feel like? But I suspect many of us today know what it feels like to be trapped, or to feel trapped, to feel like you can't provide, or to be scared for the future. So at least let's try and live in that emotional place. That's the kind of feelings that they would have. And these women, they come to the king, they ask for salvation. He kind of says, I don't know where salvation is, while cursing God. If only there were a prophet whose name meant God saves, that he could go and talk to. And then Elisha, God saves, gives this promise that by the end of the day, or sorry, by the end of tomorrow, everything will have turned on its head. Everything will be different by the end of tomorrow. And they scoff. The men who the king sent to kill Elisha, and the king himself who's followed with them, they scoff. Because how could this thing be? So let's keep reading. Let's find out what happens. Verse 3, chapter 7. Now there were 4 men who were lepers. This is supposed to sound like the setup to a joke, which might sound very totally odd after what we've read, but it's supposed to make us go, hang on, what? Lots of the words rhyme with the words in the sentence before, which, again, is not a thing we could catch in English. It's not really a way of translating it like that. But it's strange, and it sounds strange. There were 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate, and they said one to another, why are we sitting here until we die? If we said, let us enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we die there. If we sit here, we die also. So now come. Let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die. So they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. But when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no one there. For the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of chariots and of horses, the sound of a great army. So they said one to another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us, the king of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt, to come against us. So they fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses and their donkeys, leaving the camp as it was, and fled for their lives. And when these lepers came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent and ate and drank, and they carried off silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent and carried off things from it and went and hid them. So some lepers, suddenly the scene has changed. Some lepers creep into the gate, which is not really where they're meant to be. They're not allowed in the city, they're meant to be outside. We heard from JP last week a little of what it was like to be a leper in a time slightly after this, but similar setup in this day. Not allowed in, excluded. Supposed to stay away from everyone. So they kind of creep into the gate, and they have a bit of discussion about what their options are. And essentially it looks like everywhere they go, they're going to die. So they kind of figure it out logically. There is a tiny chance that if they wander over to the Syrian army, they don't get killed. And I'm like, well, it can't be worse, can it? Maybe we'll try that. Not in faith or hope, in utter desperation. If there is a tiny chance someone doesn't kill us over there and we don't die of food. We're probably going to die, but let's go see. It can't be worse. We'll live that sentiment today. And then, I don't know if you caught what's actually going on in the text, but essentially as they walk towards the Syrians, these 4 lepers, maybe thinking about, should we shout them clean as they come in? Maybe we should. Just shout them together for friends. Don't really have anyone else in the world. The Syrian army over there hears, as they come, these 4 lepers, an enormous clamour, and is terrified, and runs away from them. They run away from them. These 4 lepers. It's the perfect comic timing. The army hears a loud sound and they flee, leaving all of their food and all their animals on the ground. So that as they come into the camp where they're thinking, maybe we're going to die, they find a feast. More food than they've seen in more than 7 years. Laid out before them, animals and food and provisions and tents and equipment and bounty. Probably worth the wonder. And they take it and they hide it because food's very expensive and they're thinking maybe they can live on it. And then verse 9, they say to one another, we are not doing right. They kind of have a bit of an awakening. This day is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait until the morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household. So they came and called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, we came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no one to be seen or heard there. We scared them off, that's what happened. Nothing but the horses tied and the donkeys tied and the tents as they were. Then the gatekeepers called out, and it was told in the king's household, and the king rose in the night and said to his servants, I will tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we are hungry. Therefore they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the open country, thinking, when they come out of the city, we shall take them alive and get into the city. And one of his servants said, let some men take 5 of the remaining horses, which presumably they're keeping for food. Seeing that those who are left here will fare like the whole multitude of Israel who have already perished, let us send them and see. So they took 2 horsemen, and the king sent them after the army of the Syrians, saying, go and see. So they went after them as far as the Jordan, and behold, all the way was littered with garments and equipment that the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. And the messengers returned and told the king. The king, who's Jehoram, who we've met a few times before, who never does very well, he thinks it's a trick. He thinks that these lepers are the stooges of the Syrian army, and it's just a way of finishing the siege quickly. Get them all to go out into the light and fall on them and kill them. Which we might laugh at, because it's clearly not. But I think we might have felt the same in his place. Hearts battered by grief and disappointment. How could you possibly believe that your salvation had come? I can kind of relate. That in this surprising set of events that don't make any sense, from someone who has long given up believing that God will act for him, how could he believe? How could he believe that this is the day of his salvation? Come in the mouths of lepers. And I wonder if anyone feels a bit like that today. Maybe even your friend has told you this morning or this week, God has been so good to me, and told you about all the things that the Lord has done. Praise God. And yet what your heart wants to say is, but he hasn't done it to me. I cannot believe that there is good coming. It's been too long. Too hurt, too disappointed, too full of grief to lift up my head and believe that that's true. Friends, if that's how you feel, you're not getting condemnation from us today. Well done for being here. But there is good news. I'll finish the story. And the people went out and plundered the camp of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king had appointed the captain, on whose hand he leaned, to have charge of the gate, and the people trampled him in the gate, so that he died, as the man of God had said when the king came down to him. For when the man of God had said to the king, 2 seahs of barley shall be sold for a shekel, and a seah of fine flour for a shekel, about this time tomorrow in the gate of Samaria, the captain had answered the man of God, if the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could such a thing be? And he said, you shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it. And so it happened to him, for the people trampled him in the gate, and he died. which maybe doesn't sound like good news. But it is good news. What we find is that Elisha's promise that he gave the day before is true in every detail. That suddenly food is available for... We might assume, I guess, reading this, because these weights and measures don't mean anything to us, that it suddenly is all really cheap. It's actually still quite expensive, which I think is an interesting detail to pick up on. This is about, where have I written it down? About 6 times more than the usual going rate, but astronomically cheaper than what it was the day before. So it's not like everyone's lives have suddenly become really easy, but they can eat. That there is food. The bounty is extravagant from where they were, and yet there's still difficulty. It's still not easy. It's not like suddenly everyone is really rich and has all the food that they could possibly want, but everyone gets to eat. Which I think is a good message for us to take in as we start to think what this has to say to us. God's provision is never a promise of an easy life. It's a promise of provision, that we can keep on going, that he'll get us to the end, that there will be food, that we'll be able to get up again tomorrow and survive. Often there's much more than that, but sometimes not. So what a strange story. I mean, it's kind of dark. What are we supposed to do with this? And I was trying to think about what is a good real-world parallel of what on earth is going on here. And you might be surprised where I've gone. I was at a pantomime at Christmas. This is oddly like a pantomime. I don't know if you might not have called that. We were there with some family on the south coast where Helen's family live. And we went to pantomime, it's kind of famous locally. It's very funny. Almost everyone had COVID and there was no cast. Which honestly made it funnier, as you can imagine, because they just played up to it and everyone had to play 3 roles and no one knew what the words were. And it's a pantomime, it doesn't really matter. It's silly. And they all make the characters played by a big burly bloke, like it always is, and the prince is played by a woman, like normal, and everything's kind of backwards. Oh, and you're shouting, he's behind you at the stage and loving it, and the kids don't really know what's going on, but you think it's hilarious. And it's just really silly. Because everything is turned on its head. Pantomimes are funny because they're about reversals. They're about everything being backwards from what you'd expect. And they're about everyone getting the joke and playing out and deciding to laugh anyway. This is a comic story. You might not think so. It's a but it ends with a feast, which is how comedies work. It's a comic story of reversals. There are a lot of jokes in the Hebrew that I could try and explain, but you know what happens when you explain the joke. It's not funny anymore. But there are, like, it's deliberately comic. Lots and lots of... So a native reader, which is the kind of thing that there is nothing we can do about because there's no way of putting it into our language, but a native reader would be like, this is kind of funny, this sad, dark story, and not quite know how to feel about it emotionally. But think about it, expensive things are suddenly cheap. Fortunes have turned. God's mighty army with which he routs the Syrians. Now, in the previous passage, there was an army of like angels and fiery chariots. He didn't use them this time. He used 4 lepers who have no hope and think they're going to die. That's God's mighty army who save a city they can't enter. And we have this strange parallel between these desperate women who are considering eating their own children and 4 lepers who then share all the spoils of everything that they have. Everything is backwards. Everything is turned on its head. Every character gets the opposite of what you expect to happen to them. It's meant to be a bit funny. Well, what do we do with that? Because actually that's a theme which you can catch running through quite a lot of the Bible. Things are turned on their heads, things are backwards, things are not the way round that you expect them to be. Think about it like this. If what JP was saying to us last week about lepers and the leper who encountered Jesus, who was willing to touch him, if we can see ourselves in the leper, this man who is put outside, who cannot enter, who is not able to come into the presence of God on his own merits, then a leper who is unexpectedly invited to a feast, who finds themselves surrounded by food they didn't earn. That's the gospel. That's the reason we're here. I don't know if you quite catch that, but that's the reason we're here. People who have no right to come in, who don't do anything to come in. In fact, they left in desperation, went the other way, and finally they stumble into a great feast of food laid out for them, unexpectedly, that they haven't earned, and that they then feel pricked that maybe they should share with some others. That's the Christian story. That we would find ourselves lepers, outcasts, and yet gifted by God everything you could possibly imagine: faith and hope and a future and salvation and food. That unexpectedly, when we were running the other way, without us doing anything about it, and then find ourselves kind of pricked that maybe we should share that with some others. That's our story. You and I are these 4 lepers. I mean, literally in my case, and on the Bible's definition, I have leprosy. I imagine many people here do, actually. I have a skin condition very well controlled by modern medicine that would fit in the category of biblical leprosy. I would not be allowed within the camp. That will be true of many people here. Lots of modern skin conditions fit under the broad category of something visible on your skin. That is what leprosy is. And yet I'm invited in, all the way in. I find that I'm declared clean, and then made clean. And then there's a seat at a table with food. It's the excluded who discover and announce the good news. That's the gospel, that's the Christian story. It's the excluded who are invited in. It is them who Jesus loves, or has the most time for, in the Gospels. Those who are cast out on the edges, who are invited in, which is all of us. But especially those who find themselves excluded in our society, invited in, given everything. It's good news. The low feast and those in high places are trampled. That's the final reversal, that it's the lepers who get the food and this great captain who scoffs at God, who doesn't. Who gets it might seem quite shocking to us, that that's the outcome. But so we catch it. There's an invitation to the low, to the humble, to those who don't scoff, to those who are not full of pride, to come in and find themselves loved, and that there is a table made for us. Jesus' kingdom is one that welcomes humble, generous lepers. That's who we're supposed to think of ourselves as. Wow, I'll move on from a second. It isn't who we're supposed to think of ourselves as, but let's start there. Humble, generous lepers, those who are outcast, who can't get in, who could not, if we tried, enter the presence of God. I've said this about 4 times now, but my heart needs it, so I'm going to trust that yours does too. Cannot enter the presence of God, have absolutely no way of getting in, coated in our sin and our shame and our guilt. Humble, which simply in this case means understand that we can't get in, can't work it up, and yet invited. And then find a generosity towards others. Yes, to tell them about this, but also to share what we have. Bubbles in our hearts. We're welcomed. And then we find that we're cleansed and no longer lepers. And yet the proud are excluded. The story is reversal. It's a pantomime. It's backwards. It's all upside down. And so is God's kingdom. Because you and I find that we're not lepers anymore, but we're princes and princesses. It's the pantomime all over again. It's the one in rags who turns out to be the rightful heir. That's the Christian story. That you and I, who have nothing, finite in God, we're given everything, and more than everything, rights and a right to rule, and told that in the age to come, which is much longer than your life right now, you will be a king or a queen, an emperor or an empress, over a section of the cosmos, moving from nothing to everything. It's backwards. It's upside down. The poor are lifted up, the lonely welcomed, the barren given a place to live, those who are on the outside pulled in, those who have nothing given everything. It's backwards. Thank goodness it is. It's about receiving, not taking. That's what Jesus did on the cross, the opposite of Adam, who took. Jesus said, no, not your will, but my will, God, in the garden. And then was given everything, which he then in turn gives to us, receiving, not taking. Choosing to live God's way, not our own way. It's backwards. And of course, the greatest reversal of them all, and the way we know that this is true, and that this strange story of the seed is good news to us, is that life himself died to kill death and give life to the dying. And then walks out the back, having descended to the dead and grabbed our chains, walked out the back through a 2-minute garden and dragged all the dying into glorious life. It's a reversal. It's a comedy. But the one who died would then laugh and gather himself a great train of captains to release and kill death in death. I mean, is there better news? There's not. There couldn't be. How could there? I mean, you say it, and maybe it sounds silly. It's the truth in which the world turns. It's the thing that changes everything. Death is dead, and always will be. But Christ has won, and he always will have. Which means that every sadness, whether petty or deep, will be undone. And a feast, which we're going to eat in a minute, a feast has been laid for us, and we're all invited. It's good news. It's good news, and yet 24 hours before, when King Jehoram is waiting for this reversal and has clearly given up, that he would say to these poor women, let God save you, with a tone of that's not going to happen. That he would come to Elisha and say, this trouble is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer? I mean, there's a joke there, I suppose. What's the secret of comedy? Timing goes the joke. It doesn't work when I tell it to you. You have to ask me. It's a thing. Anyway, the secret of comedy is in the timing. He's asking immediately before the answer comes. He's given up one day too soon. And yet I find him very relatable. And I wonder if you do too. I mean, he's angry at Elisha. He's sensible to kill him. Why is he angry at Elisha? I kind of get it. Last time we saw Elisha, he was letting Syrian soldiers go, having captured a whole bunch of them. And then he made them friends, and they sent them off, and they've come back. He kind of allowed them to regroup. He hasn't done anything to lift the siege. It's been a long time. 7 years of famine and no help. Oh, and a few years back, he healed their military commander. Naaman fixed his leprosy so that he could then lead his armies. Elisha doesn't seem to be on their side. He seems to be on the other guy's side. What's going on? What is God doing? I kind of get why the king would be angry. Why should I wait for God any longer? And he's torn his clothes, and we've seen underneath that there is sackcloth, which, tiny little detail, tells us he's kind of been having a go at repenting. It's a bit like he's tried repentance and faith, but there's only disaster. It didn't work. That's kind of relatable too. I wonder if anyone here feels like that. Why should I wait on the Lord any longer? Or I've tried repentance and faith. That's the way of Jesus. That's what we do. I've tried that. It doesn't seem to have worked. Why should I carry on? I mean, there's something wrong in what the king is saying, for all I understand it, but there is such a thing as good and bad waiting. He's saying something slightly different to the refrain of the psalmist. He says, "How long, O Lord?" But it's not that different. So I do get it. The difference when it comes down to it is who you're saying it to. Are you addressing your pain at waiting to the Lord? Or hurling it at the world as an accusation? I do understand either. But I would encourage you to tell God. And then it's immediately before the Lord intervenes that he says this. I think it would be easy to jump to the wrong application here, I think. Because I think we could think the application is, wait a little longer, guys. It's coming tomorrow. And on the one hand, I think that's kind of true. The world is being remade, the sky will be torn away, and the world will be remade in fire, and then the dead will rise and be judged, and life will reign forevermore. That's coming. And we hang on for it. But I don't know that's the most helpful thing to say if you are with the King. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer? It feels a bit like a cruel joke that it would come tomorrow, on the day you've given up. And yet the punchline is the one I just told you, that the man walked out of the grave, which means that even if you're feeling like, how can I wait any longer? You and I are not this king. And why are we not this king? Because Jehoram, the king here, he didn't know where the food was coming from. The table had not yet been laid. It's laid the next day. But for you and I, the table has been laid. We are able to come into the presence of God and eat. We won't fix our problems, but we will get to eat God. And in a minute, that's what we're going to do, is we eat bread and drink the juice. We will get to eat God, body and his blood in bread and juice. Why is that an answer to waiting? Because to take the meal that we're going to take is to say, there is a better meal coming. Is a statement of hope. Even if you can't bring yourself to hope, even if hope hurts too much. Is to say that there is a wedding at the end of history when everything sad will come true. When life will reign. And when the dead will rise. That even if you do not have it in you to wait a day longer, when we eat, we find that God sustains us. We don't have to wait to know if there's a meal because we're about to eat it. It's true reversal. That the gospel is victory, the enemy is defeated, and that what Jesus promises us is food. I mean, that's what the gospel is. The band are going to come and break bread in a moment, but the gospel is food. That what Jesus gives us, what he promises us, is food. Enough for the day. And that there is a day coming when a feast that you cannot even begin to imagine will be ours to eat. And if that is a joyous thought, wonderful, and if today you are clinging, then eat and taste. And know that hope comes one day soon. Maybe not soon as we count it, maybe tomorrow. May it be, Lord. But one day soon, everything sad will come true. And everyone will eat freely, including you and I.